Now, to unpack this a bit more further, we are joined by activists at Kopanang Africa against xenophobia, Nigel Branken. Nigel, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. I'm sure you've seen that package which we've just played from my colleague there, Patricia Versace. What do you make of the latest evictions? Of course, they're outside of the UN offices in Pretoria.
Good evening, Mbali. Thanks for having me on here. Yes, just looking through that package again, all the emotions of the day coming up. It certainly was an incredibly difficult day to be part of and to witness some of the horrific choices people had to make today. Basically, they were given the choice to either go to Lindela, which many of them described as concentration camp-like conditions. Many of them had, in fact, been at Lindela for a number of months. There was an eviction that took place in 2019. They were taken to Lindela, and then in 2022, they were brought back by Home Affairs and put outside there. So they did not want to go back to Lindela. Of course, the difference now was that they were able to freely come and go. But Lindela's far out. The conditions are very poor. I believe there's no water there at the moment. And also it's far from work opportunities, etc. The second choice they were given was to, if they didn't go, was to face arrest and have their children removed. So I think a number of them then decided just to kind of get up and walk away. And actually, when you look at the court order, it's quite interesting because the court order talks about this affected area. So as soon as they leave the affected area, they're no longer not complying to the court order. In fact, the court order asked them to if they voluntarily left, it said they wouldn't face arrest. So many of them have chosen that. I think there's still a number of families that are looking for accommodation. So some of the families, I believe, are sleeping in parks tonight in Pretoria. I know there's one family with a young 2-month-old baby that is sleeping out in the open tonight. It was very hard to be present, I think, for everybody. And I do agree with that statement that the police conducted themselves quite well. There were, a few things that happened, but I think that there was quite a lot of respect and care in the process today. But, still we have to go back to what's actually happened. UNHCR should be taking responsibility for refugees in South Africa. That's their mandate, and they need to provide care for these refugees. And here they are going to the UNHCR and seeking help and not being able to get it.
If maybe you can just take us back to the history. I know that in the beginning they were taken to Lindela, and then they chose to go to the UN, the offices. Why did they find themselves in this position in the first place? I know that we have been facing a number of problems in the past due to xenophobic attacks and xenophobic violence. Why did they choose now to abandon the Lindela campsite and, of course, then go outside to the UN, the offices?
Yeah, so you're right. They originally moved to the UN offices in 2019 and were seeking the UN's help because of xenophobic attacks. It's interesting when you go, well, it's not interesting. Interesting is not the correct word. It's quite disturbing when you listen to some of their stories of some of the attacks and people that they've lost and the injuries that have occurred to them. And they had come to South Africa fleeing war-torn countries. They're legitimate refugees. They've all got refugee status, although some of their documentation has lapsed during COVID, and that needs to now be sorted out. But they essentially in 2019 went to the UN offices and said, we can't stay in South Africa anymore. What's happening in South Africa is horrific. We're not safe here. There was a woman I spoke to today who talked about having moved to several different communities, and in each community having experienced xenophobic attacks. And so just not feeling safe in South Africa, went to the custodian of refugees, to the UNHCR, where people who are refugees should get help. And the UNHCR has completely failed them, completely failed to help them. And they then protested outside there. And then they were taken, there was an eviction in 2019 where they were then taken to Lindela. And then the Department of Home Affairs actually brought them back. I think it was in May 2022. And so then a whole process then began again to from the city of Tshwane, working with UNHCR and the building owners and Home Affairs and all the others who were involved in the eviction today. And there was a process to kind of also try and negotiate it. Lawyers for Human Rights, who I went with today and volunteered with today to support, they had been approached by the court to be an amicus, a friend of the court, and actually ordered by the court to try and provide solutions. So, but it was very difficult for them. I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, even today, as we were trying to engage and talk to some of the refugees about saying, you know, surely it's better to go to Lindela with your children than to face arrest. Many of them said, well, Lindela is like a concentration camp. If I go there, it's a place where I just go to die. And the experiences and the memory, I think, of Lindela is something that was quite traumatic for so many of them, that they felt even just living on the streets would be better than going to this facility, despite the fact that they were offered, you know, food and bedding and those kinds of things. It's a horrific space.
Nigel, I mean, you've given us a number of the reasons why so many of them actually find themselves in South Africa. You know, they come from war-torn countries. What would be, you know, the laws that govern refugees in this country, you know, just so that they have a dignified kind of life?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the right person to ask about that. But certainly, you know, we are signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, and what I understand is that people who are legitimately fleeing war or persecution, they fear for their life in the country that they're coming from, can claim refugee status. So when people come into South Africa, they would go to a reception center, they would apply for refugee status. They would be given, theoretically, what's called a Section 22 permit, and that's an asylum seeker permit. And then after time, they get a Section 24 permit, which is the refugee permit that they get issued with. And once they're a refugee, then they have the right to work in the country, to live in the country, to resettle in the country. The UN does sometimes repatriate people to other countries as well. Which is essentially the service that many of these refugees were asking for. So the UN, I suppose, has a responsibility to protect well, not I suppose, the UN certainly has a responsibility to protect refugees in all the countries that they flee to. And if a country becomes unsafe, I would say it certainly is the duty of the UN to look at how do you look after those people who are in your custodianship, you know? If we were in, as South Africans, we're in a country, and we've seen this, where there's been challenges in that country. Even our South African government, with its limited resources, has tried to repatriate South Africans back from crisis spaces. And you know, in international law, one would expect a United Nations agency to really look at how do we protect these refugees, you know? So there are services available, but we just don't have enough resources at the moment in the country to really offer the kind of protection refugees are needing. And then on top of that, we've got these incredibly xenophobic attitudes that are emerging all over and needing combating. So it's a very challenging and pernicious kind of situation that refugees find themselves in.
All right. Thank you very much. Of course, that is Nigel Branken, is an activist from Kopanang Africa against xenophobia.